It started with Karen screeching about unauthorized air traffic, as if I'd flown a fighter jet through her living room. She stood in my driveway, one slipper on, hair in full chaos mode, pointing up at my helicopter like it had just insulted her personally. I had just landed from a routine inspection flight, blades still slowing to a hum, when she marched up holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "This is a violation of HOA Policy 7.3, no large vehicles on lawns," she shrieked. I almost laughed, except she wasn't kidding. And then she handed me a notice. Bold red letters across the top said, 72 hours TO remove or we tow. That's when I knew. She had no idea who she was dealing with. My chopper was legally registered, FAA certified, and fully cleared. I wasn't just a homeowner, I was a licensed pilot with a helipad and receipt. But she was just another overreaching HOA president who thought a clipboard gave her airspace jurisdiction. Big mistake. This war was about to go airborne. When I first moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, the idea of having my own private helipad was both practical and sentimental. My late uncle, who used to run aerial survey missions, left me his Bell 505 along with the small parcel of land attached to the house. That parcel just happened to include enough open space for a legal landing zone, verified and mapped in county record. I had taken every precaution: permits, noise compliance forms, and FAA coordination. It wasn't a daily thing. Just used it for surveying rural infrastructure or short transport hops when traffic in the city became unbearable. For the most part, neighbors found it cool. Kids waved. One even asked to take a picture in the cockpit. Everyone, that is, except Karen. Karen, president of the HOA, had always been a stickler for rules. She once fined a neighbor for hanging Christmas lights on November 1st instead of waiting until December. Her reputation was built on control, clipboards, and what she liked to call neighborhood visual harmony. The moment she spotted my helicopter landing that evening, something inside her snapped. She barreled down the street, bathrobe flapping behind her like a superhero cape of petty authority, and immediately started ranting about how helicopters didn't belong in residential ambience. At first, I genuinely tried to de-escalate. I walked over calmly, still wearing my flight headset around my neck, and explained that I had FAA clearance, local land use approval, and that the chopper produced less noise than a lawnmower. She cut me off mid-sentence to demand visual proof of such nonsense. So I showed her. I had laminated documents in my home office precisely for moments like this: copy of my pilot license, air traffic waiver for low-flight approach, and even the HOA's own charter that didn't prohibit aircraft landings on private property. She scanned the papers like they were printed in ancient Greek and barked, "Well, this still doesn't look right," before stomping away. I figured it would blow over. I figured wrong. The very next morning, she hand-delivered an HOA violation notice, an actual printed and signed document accusing me of parking unauthorized machinery on the lawn. In the comments section, she had scribbled something about propeller-related damage to community tranquility and wind turbulence interfering with flower beds. I nearly spit out my coffee. This wasn't a joke. She was trying to start a full-on crusade. Later that afternoon, I noticed my mailbox was filled with HOA newsletters that now included an entire section titled Airborne Threats to Neighborhood Safety. Right underneath it was a grainy picture of my helicopter, angled in such a way it looked like it was attacking the HOA clubhouse. Things escalated faster than I expected. Karen began rallying the board. One of them, a guy named Ron who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, started measuring distances from my helipad to nearby homes, as if he was preparing an artillery strike. Karen took it further by standing at the edge of my property and filming every landing I made, narrating each with phrases like, "Note the aggression in the descent pattern," and "clearly a threat to shrubs and pets." I caught her whispering to a neighbor one evening that helicopters attracted crime. I wondered if she thought Batman was about to drop in and start robbing people. Then came the most outrageous step. The HOA issued an official removal notice. It said I had 72 hours to remove the aircraft in question, or it would be considered a community hazard and towed. Like they could slap a boot on my skid and drag the thing down the street with a pickup truck. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so stupid. I sent them a cease and desist letter and copied in both the FAA and my attorney. I assumed that would put an end to it. But Karen doubled down, calling a special emergency HOA meeting to revisit local air usage ethics. At the meeting, which I attended just to witness the spectacle, Karen unveiled a homemade slideshow. The first slide said, Operation Sky Menace. She pointed at my helicopter like it was a UFO and asked the room, "Is this what we want in our skies? Noise, danger, and spinning blades of chaos." A few of the neighbors chuckled under their breath. One whispered, "I kinda like the helicopter." But Karen was on a mission. She declared the entire matter a threat to community cohesion, and demanded a vote to enforce the removal order. I reminded them again, calmly, that airspace is regulated by the federal government and that they had zero legal standing to enforce flight policy. Her response? "This isn't about law. It's about neighborhood spirit." The board, sensing the tension, hesitated. Ron raised his hand and said maybe they should consult a lawyer. Karen shot him a glare so sharp he nearly put his hand back down midair. Still, they agreed to hold off on enforcement for now. But she wasn't done. The next day, a tow truck actually showed up at my house. The guy looked at my helicopter, looked at his flatbed, looked back at me, and said, "Yeah, I'm not touching that." I gave him a bottle of water and he left, shaking his head, muttering something about crazy HOA ladies in aviation. That's when I knew the next move had to be mine. I wasn't going to wait for Karen to find someone reckless enough to try hauling off my helicopter. I made a few calls, got some approvals expedited, and began preparing a backup landing plan. If she wanted to play turf wars, then so be it. What Karen didn't know was that part of her perfectly manicured lawn was actually community greenbelt property held in common trust. And it just so happened to fall within the range of FAA-approved emergency landing zones. The irony? That space had once been intended for neighborhood recreation. It was about to become a very loud symbol of her failure. Because if she pushed me again, if she tried one more fake complaint, one more empty threat, I was going to land on her lawn. Legally. Publicly. And with half the neighborhood watching. Karen started a battle she didn't understand, with a pilot who had airspace rights, legal backing, and a whole lot of patience running out. I wasn't just going to win this fight. I was going to make sure every time she looked out her front window, she remembered exactly how high above her authority truly ended. By the time the neighborhood newsletter came out the following Monday, I was both flattered and insulted. Page 3. Right between a reminder about trash collection and a blurb on the upcoming bake sale, was a new section titled Airspace Invasions and Resident Safety. It was complete with a stock image of a helicopter hovering over a suburban home, which looked suspiciously similar to mine, though pixelated just enough to dodge any libel claims. The write-up was classic Karen. Melodramatic, misinformed, and dripping with passive-aggressive phrases like, "Some homeowners seem to believe their property extends into the heavens." I stared at the page, chuckling to myself. The newsletter even included a QR code that linked to a survey. Should HOA ban all aerial vehicles from the community? The kicker? The vote was non-binding and legally useless. But it didn't stop Karen from plastering flyers with the same survey all over streetlight poles like it was an election year. Things took an even more ridiculous turn when she began distributing what she called no-fly zone window clings. Bright red stickers that featured a silhouette of a helicopter in a big circle with a line through it, like my aircraft was a cigarette being banned from a restaurant. I found 3 on my mailbox alone. My neighbor Mike, a retired Navy guy, had one slipped under his door and came over laughing so hard he had to sit down. "She thinks this is Vietnam and you're dropping napalm on hydrangeas," he said between gasps. At this point, I wasn't even mad. I was just baffled at the level of energy she was willing to waste for something so absurd. But I also knew Karen. This wasn't about the helicopter anymore. It was about control. She had lost the ability to intimidate me, and now she was doubling down. Midweek, I noticed something strange hovering near my property. At first I thought it was a bird, but then I heard the mechanical whir. A drone. Small, store-bought, and poorly flown, it wobbled in the air like a drunk mosquito. It circled my helipad, hovered a little too long over my roof, then dipped dangerously low toward my vegetable garden before shooting back toward Karen's property. I followed it with binoculars and watched as it crash-landed in her backyard. I didn't even need proof. It was obvious who sent it. Still, I installed a motion-activated camera on the edge of my property just in case she decided to play James Bond again. Later that evening, my camera caught her sneaking along the hedgerow with a flashlight, clearly trying to retrieve the downed drone without being seen. She wore all black, but her sweater had sequins that glinted every time she moved. Real stealthy. She eventually found it and scurried back inside like a raccoon raiding a trash can. The next morning, she had the nerve to post on the community bulletin that an unknown vandal had downed her drone during a peaceful neighborhood survey. I wanted to ask what kind of peaceful survey involved spying on my backyard at 11 p.m., but I held back. I had bigger plans forming. Around this time, Karen's next tactic came in the form of a noise complaint hotline. She set up an HOA voicemail inbox where neighbors could call and leave messages about disruptive sound. The problem? She only advertised it after my helicopter flights. One neighbor told me she'd been handed a form with a pen already attached, as if they were supposed to sign it on the spot. Karen then bragged at a meeting that she had received 19 complaints in one day. I asked her to play them. She refused. So I pulled up the flight log from my aircraft, showing I hadn't flown once that day. It was obvious she was manufacturing outrage. But still, the theater continued. She wasn't just annoying me, she was harassing the entire neighborhood into participating. One elderly couple, the Jacobs, told me Karen offered to mow their lawn for free if they agreed to sign her air pollution affidavit. Mrs. Jacobs said she took the deal because her back's bad and Karen's mower is quiet. Even the HOA vice president seemed uneasy now. Ron, the guy who looked like he was always 10 seconds away from quitting, stopped by my place under the pretense of discussing community harmony. He sipped on the lemonade I offered and finally sighed, saying, "Look, between you and me, this has gone way too far. Karen thinks you're some kind of tech spy." I blinked. "Come again." He explained that Karen had this theory, completely unfounded, that my helicopter flights were part of a larger plan to surveil the HOA for some corporate interest. She thought my land, my quiet demeanor, and even my weatherproof cameras pointed to something more sinister. In her mind, I wasn't just a pilot, I was some sort of suburban secret agent. That explained the paranoia, the drone, the meetings, the flyers. I didn't know whether to laugh or be concerned. Ron leaned in and said, "She's convinced you're here to expose something. She's become obsessed." "Expose what?" I asked. He paused. "That's the weird part. She doesn't even know. But whatever she thinks you're up to, she's preparing for war." That settled it. I wasn't going to let this spiral any further. I drafted an official complaint to the HOA board outlining every incident: drone trespassing, false tow threat, public defamation, tampering with mailboxes. I attached photos, video evidence, and witness statements. I even included a screenshot of her posting in a neighborhood group asking if anyone knew how to detect listening devices. Ron told me privately that half the board was on edge but too scared to challenge her directly because she threatened to report them for lack of diligence. By Friday, I received a registered letter from the HOA. Inside was another warning, not about the helicopter, but now about excessive lawn equipment storage. Apparently, My helipad was now being reclassified as equipment storage under revised guidelines. The mental gymnastics were Olympic level. I responded with a detailed letter from my lawyer, which pointed out that any attempt to reclassify air travel-related infrastructure retroactively would not only be illegal but could expose the HOA to serious liability. It ended with a line that read, "My client is prepared to take this matter to federal jurisdiction if necessary." But I didn't stop there. With FAA coordination, I requested an updated regional flyover permit for light training exercises. Once approved, I began conducting short practice flights around the neighborhood, completely legal, fully documented, and respectful of height and noise regulations. I flew slow, hovered low enough to wave at neighbors, and always landed with gentle precision. And people noticed. Kids ran outside to wave. Dogs barked with excitement. Parents took pictures. It became clear that the only person not enjoying the show was Karen. On one particularly sunny afternoon, I descended just as she was trimming her hedges, her arms flailing in the air like she was trying to shoo away a storm cloud. I waved. She dropped her clippers in the grass. That evening, she held yet another emergency HOA board meeting titled Airborne Menace Escalation. Ron told me later that the board barely let her speak. The rest of the members were tired. Tired of the fake complaints, the paranoia, and being dragged into a legal battle with someone who clearly knew the rules better than they did. And yet, she still didn't stop. If anything, she got quieter, and that was the most dangerous part. Karen wasn't giving up. She was plotting something. I could feel it. The storm hadn't passed. It had just moved to the eye of the hurricane. She wasn't going to give up until she either grounded me or made one last desperate move. And I was ready for it. Because if she took one more swing, I was going to finish this conflict the only way she'd understand. Not in a courtroom. Not with paperwork. But with precision, rotors, and the sound of justice landing on freshly mowed grass. The silence was the loudest warning. After weeks of constant noise, drone buzzing, HOA newsletters, bogus complaints, and Karen's shrill interruptions, there was suddenly nothing. No flyers on my mailbox, no emails from the HOA, no social media posts hinting at the dangerous pilot menace. Karen had gone quiet. Too quiet. For someone like her, silence wasn't peace, it was plotting. I knew something was coming, something bigger than surveys and sticker campaigns. I could feel it. And I wasn't wrong. It was a Tuesday morning when I discovered the sabotage attempt. I had just walked out to do a pre-flight check before a scheduled infrastructure survey across town. The sun was out, the air crisp, and everything seemed routine until I spotted something glinting near the rear rotor. I approached and immediately noticed the safety cover had been tampered with. The bolts weren't just loose, they were gone. Completely removed. I stopped in my tracks, adrenaline kicking in as my eyes scanned for any further signs of tampering. It didn't take long. One of the landing skids had been loosened, and someone had tried, clumsily, to access the fuel compartment. Had I taken off without checking, the helicopter could have spun out of control within minutes. It would have looked like pilot error. It would have been blamed on me. I called the police immediately and filed a report. An officer came out, took photos, logged everything, and confirmed that it was deliberate sabotage. "Looks like someone wanted this thing grounded, or worse," he muttered, examining the tool marks near the rotor. I handed over my motion sensor footage, which captured a shadowy figure on the edge of my property at 2 a.m., crouched low and fumbling with the equipment. The image was grainy, but the frame caught one thing clearly: the outline of a clipboard in the person's hand. It didn't take Sherlock Holmes to guess who it was. I sent the footage and police report straight to my attorney and followed up with the FAA. Karen had finally crossed the line from obnoxious to criminal. Attempted interference with an aircraft was a federal offense. No amount of HOA power would shield her now. And still, part of me knew that even this wouldn't stop her. She was like a blender with no lid, spinning violently, making a mess, and completely unaware of the damage. I wasn't going to wait for her next stunt. It was time to go on the offensive. The plan began with paperwork. I requested formal FAA designation for an emergency alternate landing zone on HOA Common Access Greenbelt. It wasn't some spiteful prank. Technically speaking, it was a smart safety decision. If my primary helipad was ever sabotaged or blocked, I needed a nearby safe fallback. I submitted satellite images, location data, wind flow calculations, and received a preliminary clearance in less than 48 hours. The Greenbelt just happened to be the open field directly adjacent to Karen's prized front lawn. The irony was exquisite, but I didn't stop at that. I reached out to the local aviation board and offered to host a public safety demonstration on private helicopters, how they worked, what safety protocols we followed, and why they weren't the death traps HOA propaganda claimed. I invited neighbors, journalists, and even city officials. Karen, of course, wasn't invited. But she came anyway. She hovered near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, teeth grinding as I stood next to the helicopter with a mic headset and walked people through the mechanic. A group of kids sat on the grass, fascinated. One older gentleman asked about fuel efficiency. Several residents thanked me for being so professional and clearly more qualified than the HOA gives credit for. Karen watched the whole thing unravel like it was a magic trick. The next day, she attempted to ban the event retroactively. She sent out an HOA alert claiming the gathering was unauthorized and that the Greenbelt was for leisure only, not technical propaganda. But by then, the damage to her credibility had already been done. People had seen the truth, and I had filmed everything. The following week, the HOA held its monthly meeting in the community clubhouse. I arrived early and took a seat in the front row, legal folder in hand. The room buzzed with tension. Karen stood at the podium, lips pursed, trying to pretend the last month hadn't been a public disaster. "We will now move to address repeated aviation-related disturbances," she said, her tone sharp. I stood up calmly and requested the floor. The board hesitated. Ron nodded. I walked to the front, opened my folder, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time. What I'm about to present is not personal, it's legal." I handed each board member a copy of the FAA letter approving my secondary landing site. I followed it with copies of the sabotage police report, the surveillance photo, the documented HOA flyers, and a legal memo outlining how HOA regulations do not supersede federal aviation law. Karen tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "You've spoken. Now I will." The room was dead silent as I laid out the facts. Tampering with an aircraft, spreading defamatory material, filing fraudulent noise complaints, engaging in harassment, and now obstructing safety procedures. I didn't make threats, I laid out consequences. If the HOA pursued one more baseless complaint or tampered with my property again, we would go to court. Not just HOA court. Real court. Federal court. The kind with headlines and consequences. Karen was pale by the time I finished. She stammered something about neighborhood spirit and united values, but the room had turned. Ron leaned forward and asked me directly, "Do you have legal grounds to land on the common access lawn if needed?" I nodded and passed him the FAA map. He scanned it, then looked at Karen and said, "Well, that's that." I walked home that evening not just relieved, but amused. I had won the room, the law, and even the crowd. But I also knew Karen. She wouldn't quit. She was waiting for the next opportunity, the next loophole, the next dramatic stunt. And so, when I received a tip from a neighbor 2 days later that Karen was hiring a private landscaping crew for some surprise renovations near the Greenbelt, I knew exactly what was going on. She was trying to block the secondary landing site by turning it into a flower garden or, more likely, claiming it was unsuitable for flight due to new community projects. I didn't stop her. In fact, I let her get halfway through. She ordered a crew to plant low hedges, install decorative rocks, and even placed a tiny birdbath right in the center of the cleared grass area. It looked ridiculous, like someone had dropped a cheap garden section in the middle of a football field. But she grinned like she'd outsmarted me. And that's when I acted. I filed a formal complaint with the city zoning department, citing unauthorized construction on designated emergency space. The next day, city inspectors arrived, examined the garden, and marked everything with bright red tags reading, "Unauthorized use, pending removal." Karen stood on her porch, mouth open, as workers pulled up her birdbath and loaded the rocks into a truck. Turns out, you can't decorate what isn't yours. The final blow came 3 days later. The sky was clear, no wind, perfect visibility. I had received clearance for a routine safety drill. And so, at precisely 4 p.m., I lifted off, circled once over the neighborhood, then descended slowly and smoothly onto the cleared greenbelt, just feet from Karen's porch. The entire neighborhood watched. Some clapped. Kids pointed excitedly. I waved from the cockpit as the rotors gently kicked up a breeze, rustling the now vacant patch of lawn where her fake garden had stood. Karen didn't come outside. But I knew she was watching. Because when you try to control the sky without understanding the rules, it's only a matter of time before something lands that reminds you exactly where your authority ends. The moment my skids touched down on the freshly cleared greenbelt, it was like someone detonated a silent bomb inside the HOA. The ripple effect started immediately. Neighbors who had once quietly rolled their eyes at Karen's antics were now openly cheering. A crowd had gathered across the street, watching my helicopter settle like a futuristic lawn ornament. A few folks even filmed the landing on their phones, one of them narrating in a mock news anchor voice. And here we have local pilot Dylan making a perfect descent onto Karen's ego. It would have been hilarious even without the absurdity of it all, but knowing it was perfectly legal made it sublime. Karen didn't show her face during the landing, but I spotted her peeking out from behind a curtain like she was watching a horror movie. Except in this one, the monster was federally certified and backed by aviation law. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. That evening, the HOA group chat exploded. Someone leaked a video of the landing, and within an hour, it was being reshared with memes and hashtags like #Heligate and #KarenAirSpaceCrisis. Karen, clearly furious, tried to issue a statement accusing me of performing a reckless aerial stunt. But she had no idea that I had a full digital record of the flight plan, FAA clearance, and noise compliance readings. I posted it publicly with a note that read, "All legal. All documented. Don't believe rumors. Check the data." That shut most of it down instantly. Even the people who once backed Karen began to distance themselves. One board member resigned that night, citing burnout from irrational leadership. Ron texted me a screenshot of the resignation with the words, "Told you she'd implode." Still, Karen wasn't one to surrender quietly. She pivoted from public drama to behind-the-scenes pressure. I heard from 3 neighbors that she was calling homeowners individually, trying to convince them that I posed a security risk, and that helicopters could attract thieves. One person said she claimed my aircraft emitted magnetic pulses that interfered with garage doors. Another said she accused me of hypnotizing children with rotor sounds. It would have been comical if it weren't so desperate. She was grasping at straws, throwing anything she could to see what stuck. But this time, it wasn't working. People had seen the truth with their own eyes. The lies weren't landing anymore. Then she made her boldest move yet. She called 911. 2 days after my greenbelt landing, I was inside working on a maintenance checklist when I saw flashing lights through the blind. A patrol car rolled up, followed by another. I walked outside calmly, hands visible, and greeted the officers with a nod. One of them asked if I was the pilot. I said yes and showed them my ID and aviation license before they even asked. The lead officer, a tall man with a professional but tired demeanor, explained that they received a report about a dangerous helicopter operation endangering community members. I raised an eyebrow. He continued, "We were told there was low-altitude harassment, potential trespassing, And some kind of gas leak? A gas leak? I repeated. Yeah, he said, clearly not believing it himself. We were told the rotor wash disrupted underground piping. That's when I laughed. I couldn't help it. I apologized, regained composure, and walked them over to my computer where I had the full flight telemetry, altitude readings, FAA correspondence, and sound decibel logs. I even offered to show them the maintenance bay and flight inspection checklist. The officer took one look and said, "This is more documentation than we get at most crime scenes." To his credit, he didn't waste time. He asked if I knew who filed the report. I said I had a strong guess. They took their notes and left without incident. Later that evening, Ron confirmed what I suspected. Karen had called in the emergency complaint using the HOA office line, trying to make it sound like a neighborhood-wide issue. But now, she had dragged law enforcement into a fake emergency. That wasn't just petty, it bordered on criminal. Filing a false report is a serious offense. I didn't even have to press charges. The department opened a review of their own. The next morning, Karen's world began to collapse. The HOA board received a formal letter from the sheriff's department advising them that misuse of emergency services would not be tolerated. A few hours later, I received an anonymous email tip with a PDF attached. It was a petition Karen had circulated weeks ago to ban all non-ground vehicles from community areas. The problem? She had forged 5 signatures. I didn't need to wonder who sent it. Ron had finally decided enough was enough. At the emergency board meeting that followed, Karen tried to act like she was the victim. She gave a dramatic speech about how the helicopter made her feel unsafe, how the noise disrupted her meditation routine, and how she had been psychologically triggered by my aircraft's presence. One board member asked if she had any medical documentation for these claims. She said no. Another asked why she had used HOA funds to buy no-fly zone flyers and pay the landscaping company that built the illegal Greenbelt garden. She stuttered through her excuses until finally someone asked the question out loud. "Karen, are you just trying to get rid of Dylan because you can't control him?" That broke the dam. One by one, residents began sharing stories. A neighbor talked about how Karen once fined her for planting pink flowers instead of HOA-approved white ones. Another mentioned how Karen threatened to report him for using a hammock that was not structurally approved. Even the Jacobs, quiet and kind, spoke up and said they were tired of living under what they called dictatorship disguised as neighborhood watch. It was cathartic. It was real. It was justice. The board voted unanimously to suspend Karen from her position pending further investigation. She stormed out of the clubhouse in silence. For the first time since I moved in, there was no paper stuck to my door the next morning. No surveillance drone buzzing overhead. No petty complaints lodged by someone pretending to be the mayor of the block. Just peace. But the damage she had done still lingered. HOA morale was in the gutter. The board was in shambles. People were still tense. That's when I had an idea. Crazy at first, but it grew on me. What if I used my helicopter to bring the community back together? A symbolic gesture. A literal high point. So I worked with the new acting board president and proposed something bold. An aerial neighborhood photo event. I would take panoramic shots of the entire community from above, free of charge, and print a giant image to hang in the clubhouse. To my surprise, the idea was met with overwhelming support. Kids got excited. Parents volunteered to help coordinate. One elderly resident cried when I offered to take her up for a quick lift to see her late husband's garden from the sky. In 1 week, the neighborhood went from divided and fearful to buzzing with anticipation. On the day of the event, I flew overhead while a drone filmed from the other side. The final image showed a united neighborhood, arms waving upward, smiles wide, framed against the backdrop of blue sky and green lawns. Karen didn't show up that day, but someone spotted her watching from her upstairs window. I didn't wave. I didn't smirk. I just flew past peacefully, knowing full well she was watching something she could never control. Because in the end, she hadn't just lost a battle over airspace. She lost the support of the very people she claimed to represent. And I had gained something far more valuable than just a victory. I had earned the neighborhood's trust, and no HOA policy could take that away. It had been 2 weeks since the board officially suspended Karen, and the neighborhood had begun to feel like it was finally breathing fresh air. The HOA meetings were no longer battlegrounds of passive-aggressive chaos, and the once frantic HOA group chat had turned into a surprisingly wholesome thread of landscaping tips, birthday announcements, and someone's homemade lasagna recipe. The helicopter incident had gone from controversy to legend, and the photo from my community flyover was now framed and mounted in the clubhouse. Below the photo, someone had placed a plaque that read, "We rise together," and for the first time I actually believed it. But as peaceful as things had become, I knew it wouldn't stay that way until there was closure. Karen had gone quiet again, not the plotting kind of quiet, but the wounded, licking her pride kind. Everyone waited to see what she would do next, but nothing came. No speeches. No flyers. No half-baked sabotage attempts. Just silence. That silence was finally broken during the next official board meeting. It had been scheduled to introduce the revised HOA charter, one that included new guidelines on aerial vehicle operations, privacy boundaries, and a fresh section titled Limits of Authority, clearly inspired by recent events. I arrived early and found a seat near the back. The clubhouse was full, and the energy in the room felt different, hopeful, cautious, but steady. The acting board president, a level-headed woman named Denise, opened the meeting with a simple statement: "We're here to move forward, not back." Then, in a twist no one expected, she announced that Karen had submitted a request to speak publicly before the board and the residents. There was a soft ripple through the room. Some people exchanged glances. Others rolled their eyes. A few whispered, clearly preparing for more fireworks. I leaned back in my chair, curious but not surprised. If there was one thing Karen couldn't do, it was vanish quietly. A moment later, she stepped forward. Gone was the oversized clipboard. Her outfit was simple. No designer sunglasses. No HOA logo pin on her collar. She looked like a different person, not defeated, but deflated. She took a breath, scanned the room, and then began. She didn't apologize, not at first. Instead, she told a story about how she had moved into the neighborhood 15 years ago after a divorce, wanting structure and peace in a life that had spun out of control. She said that the HOA gave her a sense of purpose, something she could manage and take pride in. Her voice wavered once, just once, as she admitted that somewhere along the way, her pride had turned into something else. Control, fear, obsession. She didn't justify her actions, at least not directly, but she admitted they had gone too far. She said the helicopter wasn't the real problem. It was just the thing she had chosen to fixate on because she didn't want to admit that the neighborhood had changed and she hadn't. Then she did the unthinkable, she stepped down. Voluntarily. She handed in a signed letter of resignation and said, "I don't want to lead a community that doesn't trust me anymore." A strange silence settled over the room. Nobody clapped. Nobody jeered. It wasn't victory or defeat. It was simply closure. And in that moment I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just release. The long, ridiculous battle was finally over. After the meeting, a few neighbors came up and talked to me about what had happened. Most of them were relieved. Some were still wary. But one sentiment kept repeating: it's good to have a neighbor who stands up when things go too far. I hadn't meant to be a symbol of resistance, but I'd become one, even if just by circumstance. I thanked them all, politely redirected the conversation to normal things like yard work and weather, and declined every suggestion that I should run for the HOA board. I didn't want to manage anything but my own airspace. Still, I wasn't done helping. That weekend, I hosted what I called the Sky Day Barbecue. Part celebration, part thank you, and part stress detox for the neighborhood. I set up chairs in the open greenbelt area, put up a couple of tents, and partnered with a local food truck. I even arranged for a few helicopter rides, short loops just outside the neighborhood perimeter, for anyone who wanted to experience the view from above. The turnout was bigger than I expected. Families brought folding chairs, kids ran around waving handmade signs that said, "Fly High Dylan," and neighbors who had never spoken more than 2 words to each other were laughing over grilled burgers. One of the most surprising moments came when Ron showed up with a cooler and helped serve drink. He pulled me aside once and said, "You know, I thought about quitting the board months ago. But watching you stand up to all of it, that gave me the push I needed to speak out." Then he added, with a smirk, "And now I can finally go back to enjoying my retirement instead of refereeing HOA wars." But the most unexpected moment came when Karen arrived. She didn't stay long. Just long enough to walk over, hand me a small box and say, "For what it's worth, I never hated the helicopter. I just hated what it reminded me of. That I wasn't in control anymore." Then she left. Inside the box was a miniature model of a Bell 505 helicopter, perfectly painted in my color scheme. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real, honest, and somehow exactly enough. As the sun dipped below the treeline, I took one last group up for a final aerial pass. The air was calm, the view stunning. From above, the neighborhood looked like a postcard, orderly rows of rooftops, tiny fences, winding streets, and in the middle, that wide greenbelt lawn where everything had come to a head. I hovered for a moment, just long enough to take it all in, then slowly descended back to my helipad. The rotors wound down, the evening settled into peace, and for the first time in months, there was no tension left in the air. Later that night, I sat on my porch with a drink in hand, listening to the crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog. No complaints, no drama, just quiet. A neighbor from 2 doors down walked by with his golden retriever and waved. "Good flight," he called. "Best one yet," I said. Because it wasn't just about the helicopter anymore. It was about standing firm without losing who you are. About flying through turbulence but landing steady. And about proving, without shouting, that the sky doesn't belong to any HOA. It belongs to those who know how to navigate it.